Hello, I'm Kent Justice, along with Joy Purdy. After 6 days of funeral proceedings for the late former President Jimmy Carter, we thank you for joining us for this special conversation. With us are two people who have great insight to share about President Carter himself and about everything involved in planning the president's funeral.
Yes, take a look. This is retired lobbyist and power broker Mike Hightower. In the 1970s, Mike worked on the Carter campaign, and after President Carter's victory, Mike worked in the Carter administration. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
We also have with us retired Army Lieutenant General Mike Linnington. During his 35 years of service in the Army, he was commanding general of the Military District of Washington, which plans presidents' funerals, and helped plan Mr. Carter's funeral.
And with what we've seen over this last week, especially today, and we saw, I looked at some of the instructions. They're like, after the first note of this song, this person does this. I mean, it's obviously very detailed. Tell us about watching this. Was it surreal?
It was definitely surreal, Kent. I'll tell you, the Military District of Washington staff, command group, and soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines really turns into the Joint Task Force National Capital Region, which is all of the services that come together to honor former presidents in a national special security event called a state funeral. And as I was mentioning earlier, state funeral rehearsals and planning goes on constantly. And every 90 days, the Joint Task Force comes together to rehearse different phases of a state funeral should it occur. I was in Plains, Georgia in 2012, practicing the events you saw today with the team at the time that was responsible for conducting President Carter's funeral. And we do that for all living presidents. And certainly during my time, I was responsible for planning and orchestrating state funerals should it occur for President Carter, President Clinton, President Bush 41 and Bush 43. President Obama was in office when I was the Military District of Washington commander, but it's just one piece of the responsibility of what our very amazing troops do in Washington, D.C., providing ceremonial support for national special security events.
Well, General, you were explaining off camera, we were talking and chatting off camera, and you were explaining how the book to follow the directions varies per president.
Yeah, so at the time, President Carter's funeral planning book was about that thick. Pretty straightforward. We knew he was going to live in Plains, Georgia. We knew he would probably pass in Plains, Georgia. So the events you saw from the 3rd to the 7th, from point of demise through the Carter Library where he lay in repose, and then the transfer from Dobbins Air Force Base to Andrews Air Force Base, and then the trip, by the Navy Memorial to the Capitol, lay in state, funeral at the National Cathedral, and then back to Plains. It was all pretty set piece. But for the different presidents, let's take President Bush 41, for example. It could be a Kennebunkport point of demise or Houston point of demise in different ceremonies depending on where the president passed away. But the team comes together 2 hours after demise and is at the point of demise 6 hours after the president passes. And as you saw throughout the ceremonies today, Major General Trevor Breedenkamp, the commander of the Military District of Washington, my former position more than a dozen years ago, he and his team did an absolutely stellar job throughout today's events in very challenging conditions.
Yeah, and you pointed out something too. So that leader is there at the body the entire process. So for the last 2 weeks, is that accurate?
That's correct. In fact, in the as the casket flew today from Andrews Air Force Base to Lawson Army Airfield at Fort Moore, Major General Breedenkamp was on board the aircraft escorting the remains and was with the family throughout the ceremony this entire week. And it's funny, this summer I was in D.C. talking the team through, of all things, an inauguration, because I got the opportunity to be responsible for the ceremonial support for the 2013 inauguration for President Obama's second inauguration. And one of the things they were most concerned about was the potential of a state funeral for Jimmy Carter so close to the inauguration. That was, in their mind, the tsunami of events that maybe they couldn't support. And here we are, 11 days before inauguration. The rehearsals for inauguration should have started 3 days ago. So the team is I mean, those service members you saw on TV today.
A little bit of overtime.
Stretched thin.
They are, but I tell you what, nobody does it better. You could tell today just by the poise and the precision of the body bearers, the escorts, the 7 different task forces, ceremonial task forces, and the 29 agency partners that support this national special security event. Everybody from the Secret Service to the FBI, Park Police, Capitol Police, local police, Metropolitan Police, local polices, escorts. It's pretty phenomenal.
Golly. Well, Mike Hightower, you shared with us some really incredible pictures of you with President Carter. We're going to show everybody some of those. Everyone we've heard from during funeral services has talked about the president's decency, his character. What can you share about that? You worked with the man.
When I was listening to the general talk about the book and the detail, the president would be so proud. He was a detailed man. He was like that during the campaign. He was like that any of the time. One of his reputations, he was he got into the weeds very quickly. So when I was hearing,
when I was listening, would do, right?
Yeah, that was during the that was getting ready for the national election. This was the primary. That was in the primary. As you can tell, you could be right there with the president. You don't think you could? I can do that now. I drove him around in my Dodge Dart. Which was not automatic. It was stick shift.
What?
Yeah, and I mean, and Rosalynn, we did the same thing with the Rosalynn. And as a matter of fact, my son was 8 days old, and my wife had a reception for Rosalynn upstairs in my son's in the crib. I mean, it was. You're talking about somebody who was 28, 29 years old, and the impact that he had on me. I mean, when I was listening to his pastor and I was listening to his grandson today, and they talked about how he changed people's lives, and I'm going, that's me. How that changed. I mean, what you all have said, if it hadn't been for a chance encounter 50 years ago last month, I wouldn't be sitting at this table tonight.
A chance encounter.
A chance encounter. As I shared earlier, I was going into a reception in the Mulebach Hotel in Kansas City, Missouri, and it was going into a ballroom. There were 7 doors. I walked into door A, and I got pushed into the corner, and here stood this man saying, "Hi, I'm Jimmy Carter. I'm the outgoing governor, and I'm running for president of the United States." Stuck out his hand. Stuck out my hand, and I said, "Hi, I'm Mike Hightower. I'm the secretary of the Democratic Party in Duval County." I gave him my card, and I still have 496 of those cards if anybody wants one. And 4 months later, he comes to Jacksonville. We have lunch at the Blackstone Building downtown. He takes out a napkin, paper napkin, draws the state of Florida, and talks about how he is going to run in the state of Florida. And the big thing was Jacksonville, Florida. And for those people who remember back then, Jacksonville had been the state headquarters for George Wallace in 1968 and 1972. And he was running as a third-party candidate, which would have changed everything. And he kept saying, "What I need for you to do is get me within 10 points of George Wallace." And I said to him, "Governor," and he said, "Jimmy." And I said, "This is George Wallace's state headquarters." Didn't blink. "I got it. You need to get me within 10 points.
Yikes.
Yes, sir.
No pressure.
No pressure. Well, thanks to a whole lot of folks, an incredible group, we lost to George Wallace by only 300 votes.
Wow.
What?
Yes, and as they say, everything was history. After that, it was that changed the whole trajectory of the campaign for the South.
And it's interesting, we have that letter that he sent to you. It was a very quick note. I think we have that, where he actually thanks you. Do you see that there? It says, "To Mike and Sue," that's your wife, Sue Hightower, "I deeply appreciate the fine work you did in Florida to help my campaign. Our victory was even greater than anticipated. Thanks to friends like you, I will never forget your early support, and I will do my best to deserve your confidence." He wants you to be confident in him, and he's going to work hard for that.
That was Jimmy Carter. That And any time that he ever met with us, I mean, he would talk about the campaign. He wanted an update, and you had to do it in 25 words or less, which everybody who's listening knows Hightower can't tell his name in 25 words or less. But he wanted it very quickly, very detailed. And then as soon as he got that out of the way, it was, what's going on in Jacksonville? How's your son? What's going on? What do I need to know? And he did it in a way, and it was, and there were not, as I remember, as we drove around in my Dodge Dart stick shift,
so good.
there was nobody else in the car.
Oh gosh, no Secret Service.
No,
nothing
I mean,
like that.
nothing.
Wow.
And then, fast forward, I go to the convention, and that's when he wanted me to come back and run the national convention. So I had to give up my job. And I came back here, and we ran did the national thing here. And as you saw some of those pictures of this ragtag team, we pulled it off. And then, a couple of months later, I get to be a part of the administration. And as I'm watching this today, I'm having these flashbacks of those moments of how uniquely, as I was telling the general, as he was telling me about how detailed everything is, and he's telling me how this goes on, it was a flashback of things that he would ask or how the campaign went. And as I was telling you all earlier, I don't believe anything is coincidental. And after hearing what people talked about him today and how they talked about, yeah, there were challenges when he was president. They all have that. But then those 48 years of what he and the First Lady did, I have in my wallet, which I share with the mentoring program, it is Teddy Roosevelt's The Man in the Arena. Yeah. And for people who have read that, it is real easy to throw rocks, to criticize, but until you're in the arena, the man that gets, the sweat, who gets bloodied, the general and his men who could protect our country, it's the man in the arena who takes the hit, who does what he thinks, who knows the difference between victory and knows the feeling of defeat. But he's the one who is the victor because he goes into the arena. And that was what Jimmy Carter was. He did what was right. He was courageous. He stuck by his principles against incredible odds. He has been criticized for it, but he never lost that moral compass. He did what was right. And were a lot of people, when he left office, they could have gone and done other things, but he and the First Lady spent 48 years around the world. And how do you say thank you to someone who has done that? I mean, he and she, I believe, when you say it all together, they are the true humanitarians in our lifetime. When you think about the tens of millions of people that he has touched.
And Nobel Peace Prize for that, because of when we talked earlier, that maybe he wouldn't have been available when you were in planes because he was monitoring an election somewhere.
In Egypt, he was in Egypt, and I remember Mrs. Carter was at a community event organizing a community function. So we met with the chief of staff and the family members about some of the specifics of who was going to sit where and who was going to read and who was going to sing the hymns and which service was going to do what. But he came back from Egypt, and I distinctly remember that right after he got back from Egypt, the very next week, he went and had knee replacement surgery and was back traveling to Africa like a month later.
Wow. And
if you've ever had knee replacement, I think he had double knee replacement, which was not advised for an 80-year-old, but he did it anyway, and he was back on the street in a month. But that just goes to the passion of President Carter for trying to make a difference in life after the presidency. Yeah. And let's be honest, he could have done whatever he wanted. Yeah, and he chose to give back.
His pastor mentioned that. He would always ask those questions: who have you helped? What have you done of late to help someone else? And what can I do to help you help that person? And to that point, he had a job to do, and he did it. So.
You mentioned going to Plains. Have you been to Plains, Georgia?
Yes, sir.
This is a place I have not been. We've seen so much of it in this last week. How would you describe Plains, Georgia? Because this is a place that President Carter, when he left the White House, said, I'm going right back there. He wanted the simplicity of life rather than extravagant living somewhere and all of that. Well, how would you describe Plains, Georgia for me?
I will, General, he's been there. It's a small town, has a main street. The buildings have all been there. It, like the President's house that he and the First Lady built right after when he came out of the Naval Academy, it's pretty much the same way. I mean, it's still a small town where everybody looks after each other. Everybody goes to the same church. He's every Sunday, Saturday, he taught Sunday school. There was a rhythm. And there's a similarity, if I can say it, there's a similarity about Plains and about Jacksonville. As we all know, everybody is related in Jacksonville, one way or the other. We know that. Same thing in Plains. Everybody is there, but the general saw it from a different perspective because I don't think that you could tell. It stayed consistent. Would you not agree?
Oh, 100%. A very small town. Everybody was friendly and everybody knew each other. I was amazed by just how small the church was. I expected for a final ceremony for a former president, a grandiose church with thousands of seats. There's 12 pews, and one of the big discussions was who's going to get to attend that ceremony.
Yes.
As you can imagine, with thousands of people wanting to attend, the family had to decide on who sat in the 12 rows on the right and the left-hand side.
What is that like? Is everybody talking over each other? Is it quiet because you're trying to...
Luckily, as the commander, I didn't get into the weeds of all of that. but a lot of that was given to us from the staff and the former president's small staff. And President Carter had a very small staff from what I remember.
Yes.
Probably the smallest of all the former president's staffs. But you can imagine, Air Force One can't handle more than probably 100 and something people, but who gets to fly on Air Force One from the National Capital Region to Plains for the final resting?
Mm-hmm.
So how does this happen? You clearly retired. You were not able to carry through all of the practicing that you did for this funeral. How does that handoff happen? Do you take the book and you give it to the next person in charge?
Well, luckily we have a staff at MDW, or the Joint Task Force National Capital Region, and it's a small staff. Back in my day, it was a gentleman named Mike Wagner, who now has moved on to another job, very important job in Washington, D.C. But Mike was the continuity. He had been through 4 former commanders. So as I talked about, each one of those books was this fat. Mike knew every page of every book, and he knew the decisions the families had made before. And then I personally leaned on former commanders of the Military District of Washington to help me through my requirements, my responsibilities for the day. And as you saw today, Major General Trevor Breedenkamp, his responsibilities were largely towards taking care of the family and taking care of President Carter.
That has to be an incredible comfort for the family. And as the President Carter was planning his funeral or saying, this is what my wishes are, that has to be a great comfort to them, right?
Great comfort. One of the presidents, I think it was President Bush 41, one of the later presidents was complaining about having to talk about their funeral every 3 months. And he said, I'm too young to talk about this. And I think President Bush said, get used to it because it'll happen until the day you die. And can you imagine today sitting in the cathedral, 5 living presidents sitting there watching a ceremony that they know is going to be for them sometime in the future.
Yeah.
The troops will be different, the command will be different, the band will be different, the sequence will change a bit based on the family desires. Yeah. But this ceremony is pretty set. There's regulation, there's tradition, military regulation, military tradition, and then third is the desires of the family. The desires of the family are which band plays, which service honors with the flyover today was the Navy from, I think, Naval Station Norfolk flew over with a stop right here at NAS Jack, or maybe Mayport.
And I'd love to hear each of your perspectives on this. But as we were covering those pilots who are going to be flying, they stopped over at NAS Jacksonville. And we hear some of them, especially the 3 of them that we interviewed, who said, I'm from Georgia, and this is important. You could just tell the sense of pride. One of those pilots told us, Joy, said, this is something I'm always going to remember in my service to the Navy. What's it like for a member of the team who is involved in those traditions, in the ceremonies, in the things that honored the 39th President of the United States?
It's a responsibility that they take so personally, and they realize that they're not there for themselves, but they're representing their brothers and sisters in arms that don't have the opportunity they have. Mike and I were watching the live stream on News4JAX in the conference room. Can you imagine being the 20-year-old Navy sailor that's holding the presidential colors at the cathedral, or right in the procession from the hearse to the church service at the Baptist church, and then back to the gravesite? Can you imagine that young sailor's memories for the rest of his life?
Yeah.
Or the body bearers, the 8 body bearers representing all the military services that are carrying the casket. Imagine the pressure on them, having been through it. By the way, there's a difference between rehearsing it and doing it for real.
Yeah.
I remember the first time I laid a wreath at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier with President Obama. I had rehearsed it many, many times before because I wanted to get it perfect. But on the first time I did the ceremony, I'm walking out to lay a wreath and I tripped. And as I was tripped, right before we went on camera in front of 11 million people, President Obama kind of catches me. And I said, "Oh, Mr. President, I'm so sorry." And he looked at me and he goes, "Better you than me, man." and it broke the ice immediately. And all of a sudden I realized, I'm a human being. He's a human being. I mean, you do this, you're representing your service, but they're human. And I think what you saw today at the cathedral with 5 human beings, all having the honor of being the President of the United States, all knowing that let's face it, all of our days are numbered.
Yeah.
What are you going to do with the rest of your life? And that's something President Carter showed us, how to do it right.
Yeah.
And Mike Hightower, you actually worked with this incredible man. Rosalynn, saw a couple of pictures in there with you and Rosalynn. What about her? Tell us about her. President Carter said in an interview that he left a lot of his funeral arrangements up to her. She, of course, passed before him. But tell us about her and your dealings with her, her personality. What was she like?
I'm looking at these pictures. One, she was his rock. She 77 years. They were a team. She was passionate. He leaned on her, but she had this innate ability that when they were in a group, she could figure out who the authentic people were, who was on point, and who wasn't doing what they should do.
Like his second set of ears.
Oh, she was, and she could give you the look.
Oh.
Yeah, I don't remember getting the look, and if I did, I'm gonna lie about it. But there are a couple pictures where, after I became part of the administration, we had an opportunity in my agency to make this huge loan in South Florida, and so I literally called one of my friends. I mean, I'm thinking, I'll come back to this, but I can think of just picking up the phone and saying to my boss to say, well, you just call up there, and if you can get her, that's fine. And so I called my buddy at the White House and said, we're going to do this huge loan. I know the president, and next thing we know, the first lady is down there, and she's giving the check.
Oh.
And so, the night before, we were there with the late Claude Pepper, and then the next day, we're there giving this check. And, and she worked the crowd, and she had a great sense of humor, like he did, but they were just a unique people. And I want to say something that, why we were in the room waiting to come on, and I was listening to the general and talking about how he did that. And I realized he made the comment, I'm doing this, but all those other folks. I'm sitting here and you're asking me these questions, and I'm thinking as I'm doing this, is all those grassroots people and all those folks that were part of that primary that I had the part to be a, and then all of a sudden we come back and we're for the general election. And I just want to say to those people and to you all, thank you, because he's representing that part, which is really so important. But I'm sitting here representing all those people in that primary and in that general election, why the two of us are here. I mean, nobody does this on their own. The last thing I want to say today on this issue was today his pastor, when you talked about the book and you talked about the 5 presidents that are sitting there, when he said, this is the way it's going to be, his pastor talked about the 2 books, one, the small one, which is the Bible, and the one that says, as president, this is what you're going to do. I think what I learned from the general was, when it gets to this part about the funeral, it's not about you. It is about what's in the book. You have a responsibility and accountability to do it, because as president, this is the way it's done. Correct, sir?
That's right.
And so, there isn't, you get input, but the big book that he talked about, that's about the role and responsibility as president, because you represent everyone, and this is how we do it.
So how much of a percentage would you say, just to get our minds wrapped around this, percentage of duty, pomp and circumstance, what is expected of a presidential funeral, and the wishes of the family? Is there a percentage?
It's probably, I'd say it's probably 75% regulation and tradition and 25% desires of the family.
Do they get to tweak that tradition?
Yes, yes. I mean, if you looked at
Probably a
today's service, or actually the whole week's service, had a very specific Navy flavor to it, which made sense. President Carter being a Naval Academy graduate, having been a sub officer
incredible.
for years after graduation, and of course, it was intentional that the presidential color bearer was a Navy sailor. The chaplain, with his personal chaplain behind the colors, was a Navy chaplain. That the Navy band, and it had a lot of Navy significance. And other presidents, it's sometimes the Marine Corps band, sometimes Pershing Zone, the Army band, but it depends on the wishes of the family. There's a lot of resources. I'm watching it on TV right here. It's a replay, but a lot of resources to pull this off. But to me, the last 7 days have really shown the strength of our military and the ability of our young service members to do many, many things. All of these soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, Coast Guard, Space Force, they all have other responsibilities as well. This is a small, small piece of what they're responsible for. And they're also warfighters. So on top of the ceremonial responsibilities of what they have in Washington, D.C., they're training, they're deploying, they're doing other things. They're also representing our nation in front of our allies and our adversaries. And by the way, if you don't think the experience of the last 7 days isn't a message to our allies and adversaries, it certainly is.
What is the message?
The message is the United States military is strong, ready, and able to fight. And we honor those that serve our nation.
Yeah.
And
That thought process goes into it as well.
Don't poke the bear.
Yeah. I've been reading stories about President Carter. I remember reading a book about the transition from President Carter to President Reagan, because on that day of Reagan's inauguration is when the hostages were released. Right. And you mentioned earlier, President Carter, there were challenges. Joy is way too young to remember any of this.
Way too young.
We all
I was
remember.
5.
Oh my goodness, the high inflation, the high unemployment, those long lines at the gas stations. All of that is what a lot of people would point to in years past about, President Carter wasn't a good president. That was a terrible time. But I think even what we're hearing today, Mike, is that you can't say that about him, because there were things in those 4 years of his administration that have endured, like FEMA, other things like that. And what everybody's saying is, you look at the essence of those, as you put it, 48 years of being a great humanitarian. It's an incredible life journey to expand on and to learn from and to remember.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. You kind of have to put, number one, some of those things that he got criticized for, if you remember, he inherited. Now, again, when you read his diary, and you heard him say it, if it was under my watch, I took responsibility. He always said, buck stops with me, the Harry Truman. But when you think about the things, if it went well, it was about the team. But you kind of ought to understand the man. He was from Georgia. You got to think about what Georgia was like then. Think of how long Washington and the politics of Washington had been going on when he was a state senator, when he became governor for just 4 years. And then he goes to Washington through a campaign that nobody believed he could do. Small group, went to Washington. And you've heard the expression, the swamp. As a former civics teacher, I'm doing this in a positive way. But there were traditions, the way Washington got run, the way the system worked. He came in there with a set of ideals and a set of purposes, and he came in with a moral compass. And if you read his diary, which I have a copy of, he took it on, and he was really, I mean, he never backed down. And to your point, Ms. Justice, when you talk about the things that accomplished, how he deregulated regulation, I mean, all that, the Camp David Accords, after all these years, there is still a peace agreement between Egypt and Israel. And think about how people have built on that, or you think about some of the things that he did. You know, as I go back to the Teddy Roosevelt, the man in the arena, you know, yeah, it's easy. But, you know, he never lost sight of what he thought was right. And as far as the Panama Canal, I've heard more than I want to know about the Panama Canal. You know, when they said he gave it away, well, you know, going back to my history lesson, he didn't do anything that the process didn't allow him to do. People forget, remember, it had to take 2/3 of the United States Senate to get it done. He proposed it, but so 2/3 was 67 senators, Democrat and Republicans, agreed to the language. Now, people can criticize whether it was right or wrong, but you've got to also think about what was going on in Panama. The military men, that we had lost military men because of the unrest in Panama. We had lost military people down there. There was a lot of discrimination. There were a lot of things that he felt in his time that had to be changed. He went to the United States Senate, said he made his case. 67 senators who had been there long before went on. Now, when all the criticism, you didn't hear it from any of the 67 who took responsibility, but he said, I thought it was the right thing to do, and he never backed down. That was him. And so when I'm hearing all those things, yeah, it's easy to Monday morning quarterback, but until you've walked in those shoes and you've been there, and think about what Washington was like in the early 70s. And again, he will tell you that it was two different environments coming out of the state governor of Georgia, 1977, and what Washington, D.C. was in 1977. But he knew what he was going to do. Did it right.
I have a question for you.
Yeah.
About we're parents have kids. We look at the president-elect coming in, and we've been watching Barron grow up. Barron Trump. So during the Carter administration, there was Amy.
Yes.
Was it as off limits as it is now? I mean, usually the rule is journalists, we try to stay away from the family. Don't, kids, don't mess with the kids.
Yeah.
What was that like back then?
They tried their best. I was in Florida running Farmers Home, but I can remember I was telling the general earlier, I guess she was like 6 or 7. I mean, you can imagine moving from Plains, Georgia, or the governor's mansion and going into Washington, and everything you do, they're following it, and they protected her, tried their best, but they took her everywhere. She was, when you go back, they made her a part of the administration. I mean, she had her, where she could be seen, but for a child that way, she was very shy, and so she kind of got thrust into that incredible fishbowl. The press sort of did, every once in a while, the First Lady particularly made sure they backed off. And I can't even imagine an 8 or 9-year-old being confronted with that, and how the president is, I've got to be doing this, and the First Lady, as you know, was the first Lady to ever have an office in the West Wing. So they both have offices, but they have this 8-year-old. I'm not sure my family could pull it off.
It's interesting, though, that they took her everywhere. That's
they did, and they made that a part of it. But it was about family. That was about family. It was interesting. It really was.
Yeah. Could we go on all night? Probably. Maybe we should wrap this up. Why don't we do that with maybe just some final comments? General Linnington, really appreciate giving us some insight into what goes into all of this planning. What will you remember about this last week and the funeral services for our 39th president?
My memories from this week will really be about the military precision and the prestige and the honor of honoring our 39th president. President Jimmy Carter. And this week really makes me proud to be an American. It makes me proud to see the hard work and the dedication and the commitment of our service members, not just in Washington, D.C., but really around the world. As we sit here comfortably in this studio tonight, we've got tens of thousands of troops still deployed around the country, around the world. And as the 2,500 or so that participated in this week's events, in just 10 days, there will be 25,000 service members in Washington, D.C. taking part in the inauguration. And for all of them and their families that sacrifice as well, I just thank them for their service and thank them for keeping our country safe.
And boy, and I felt it this week as well, seeing the ceremonies. There's a swell of pride, and it's just moving to see everything that happened.
And Mike Hightower, I remember talking with you and you saying you were just sitting and watching everything and looking to see all the people that you could recognize, and oh my gosh, they're so. What kind of thing will you take away?
Pick it one. Ditto on everything everything that the general said. What I saw today, or what has come to me, is we have just come through an incredible election process where everybody is still trying to process. Picking up on what they're, and that's what democracy is. It is out there. It is not pretty. It's bare knuckles. It's ugly. But then what we saw today, we had an election. This is what it is. And now what we had this moment where the adversaries and the opponents were sitting there in reverence, saying thanks to someone that is a part of their history. And I had to think that with all the things that people can criticize about how democracy works, is we've gone through an election, but we still take time in a thoughtful, reverent way to say thank you to those people who have made it. And so it's a combination of democracy, it's a combination of our military. It is what makes America wonderful. It's what we grew up with. And that's what I thought of, with all the stuff that goes on in this world. We take time to think about the good that people contribute to. And that's what today was about. And now I have to tell you, having this last hour or so sitting with the general, and for him to talk about that part of it, I didn't realize it. I mean, this has been a civics lesson for an old civics teacher.
I got a civics lesson today as well, by the way. So, Mike, thanks for the last couple of hours. Thanks for the last couple of hours.
Thank you all.
I'm a transplant to Jacksonville. I've been here my wife and I have been in Jacksonville 8 years, but just to learn a little bit of the history of this incredible city from Mike Hightower.
Mr. Hightower knows that exactly.
But the fact that the two of you took the time to share your memories, which are like gold, the stories that we chatted about, even off camera, just incredible that you are just willing to share that with everyone. So we thank you so much.
No,
absolutely our pleasure.
It was, listen, but thank you for the opportunity. I mean, if I can say it, both of us were representing a part of our country that we were able to say we were there. It wasn't about the two of us, but we've represented the political side, and that which makes our country strong. So thank you for the opportunity.
I told my wife today I really wanted to be in Plains, Georgia today, or at the cathedral, or representing our country. But if I couldn't be there, I may as well be here with you guys.
And thank you all.
Hot dog.
Or what is it? The local station.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Michael Linnington, Mike Hightower, thank you so much for your expertise and
Thank
for
you.
the
Thank you for
great
having us.
conversation.
Thanks, Joy.
Appreciate it.
Wonderful.